In the scorching summer of 530 AD, according to the Byzantine historian Procopius, 1,000 Roman cavalrymen charged straight into an army of 30,000 Persians. The senior Roman commander personally led this suicidal attack. By sunset, the largest Persian invasion force in a generation was fleeing in total disorder. Think about those numbers for a second. 1,000 against 30,000. That's a 30-to-1 disadvantage, and the Romans attacked first. Contemporary sources confirm these figures aren't exaggerated propaganda. This actually happened. By the end of this video, you'll understand how historical records reveal one of antiquity's most brilliant tactical deceptions. I'm about to reveal 3 documented facts that will change how you see Byzantine warfare forever. First, the environmental weapon that turned 1,000 horsemen into what appeared to be an entire army. Second, why a single Persian battle standard's fall triggered the psychological collapse of 30,000 warriors. And third, the Thracian officer whose death in the moment of triumph became legendary across 2 empires. But here's what makes this battle historically extraordinary. How did a commander so crippled he had to be carried to battle on a litter fail to detect an ambush force hiding in plain sight? What tactical calculation, documented in contemporary chronicles, convinced the outnumbered Romans to attack rather than defend? Why did the Persian general Mihro, a veteran of decades of warfare, make the reconnaissance failure that cost him everything? How could seasoned Persian cavalry who'd conquered from Egypt to the Euphrates break and run from a force they outnumbered 30-to-1? This is the story of the Battle of Satala, where dust became a weapon, where terrain transformed weakness into strength, and where a single heroic death purchased victory against impossible odds. To understand how 1,000 defeated 30,000, we need to step back to the spring of 530, when the Eastern Roman Empire faced its greatest crisis in a generation. In the spring of 530 AD, according to Byzantine sources, Emperor Justinian I faced a crisis that threatened to destroy his grand vision before it even began. For 3 years, he'd sat on the throne in Constantinople, dreaming of something no emperor had dared attempt in generations: the reconquest of the lost Western Roman Empire. North Africa, Italy, Spain. Territories that had fallen to barbarian kingdoms while the East endured. But dreams required resources. And resources required a secure frontier. The Persian problem stood between Justinian and everything he hoped to achieve. The crisis had religious roots. Between 524 and 525, the Sassanid Shah Kavad I had attempted something that outraged the Christian world: the forced conversion of the Kingdom of Iberia, modern-day Georgia, to Zoroastrianism. This wasn't simply religious persecution. Contemporary chronicles documented it as a calculated tool for political consolidation of the Caucasus buffer states. When King Gorgon of Iberia revolted and sought Byzantine protection, he triggered a chain reaction. The neighboring kingdom of Lazica followed, aligning itself with Constantinople. For the Persians, these defections represented an intolerable threat to their control of the trade routes passing through the Caucasian gates. Kavad I viewed Byzantine support for these revolts as a violation of the fragile peace established after the Anastasian War of 502 to 506. He had additional grievances. Justinian's construction of the fortress at Dara, positioned dangerously close to the Persian stronghold of Nisibis, was seen as a direct provocation. The Persian Shah decided that the growing Roman military threat had to be crushed before it grew stronger. In the spring of 530, he launched a coordinated 2-front offensive that contemporary sources describe as massive in scope. the southern Persian army, numbering over 40,000 warriors, drove toward the Mesopotamian plains. In June of 530, they met defeat at the Battle of Dara, where the young general Belisarius employed innovative trench tactics to defeat a numerically superior force. But while Dara secured the southern front, the northern theater remained vulnerable. A second Persian army, 30,000 strong under the command of the veteran general Mihro, was marching toward Byzantine Armenia. Their target was Satala, the most important Byzantine fortress in the Armenian highlands. What hung in the balance was more than one fortress. Historians analyzing Justinian's strategic position recognized that control of the Armenian highlands meant control of the trade routes to the Black Sea, the upper Euphrates River Valley, and the buffer zone protecting Anatolia's heartland. If Satala fell, the road to Constantinople lay threatened. More critically, Justinian's entire Western strategy depended on a secure eastern frontier. The armies, the resources, the imperial attention required to reconquer North Africa and Italy could not be spared if Persia was rampaging through Armenia. Modern strategic analysis, particularly Edward Luttwak's study of Byzantine grand strategy, emphasizes how Justinian was attempting something extraordinarily ambitious, defending the East while simultaneously planning to reconquer the West. The emperor faced not one crisis, but three: a massive Persian invasion of Mesopotamia, a second massive invasion of Armenia, and the necessity of preserving resources for campaigns that hadn't even begun. Everything depended on a fortress in the Armenian mountains that most Romans had never heard of. But at that fortress, two very different commanders were about to collide. The man tasked with defending Byzantine Armenia was unlike any general the traditional Roman military would have recognized. Citus was born of Thracian or Gothic origin, somewhere in the Balkans, around the late 480s or early 490s. By 530, he was approximately 35 to 40 years old. His rise through the military hierarchy followed an unconventional path that tells us everything about how Justinian's empire worked. Procopius records that Citus began his career as a Dorophoros, a spearman in the personal bodyguard of Justinian before the latter became emperor. This was no ceremonial position. The Dorophoros were elite warriors who protected imperial heirs with their lives. But what truly elevated Citus wasn't just his martial skill. He married Comido, the sister of Empress Theodora, Justinian's controversial and powerful wife. This connection to the imperial family was double-edged. It gave Citus access to resources and rapid promotion to Magister Militum Presentalis, master of soldiers in the presence. But it also created pressure. He had to prove he deserved the rank, that he wasn't just another court favorite. Historical sources describe Citus as possessing what Procopius called active intelligence and being energetic in the highest degree. Between 528 and 529, he demonstrated this reputation by successfully subduing the fierce Zani tribe in the Pontus region. Rather than simply defeating them and moving on, Citus recruited these mountain warriors into Roman service. He had a talent for understanding that former enemies could become valuable allies. In the Armenian theater, he'd recruited Armenian scriniari, clerks, and administrators, building an intelligence network that would prove crucial. But Citus was more than just a talented individual. He represented the transformed Roman military system that Justinian was perfecting. The 6th century Byzantine army bore little resemblance to the legendary legions of antiquity. Infantry no longer dominated. The future belonged to cavalry, and specifically to a new type of warrior, the cataphract. Procopius provides extraordinary detail about these reformed cavalry forces, and his descriptions reveal both technical expertise and fierce pride. The Byzantine cataphract was a dual-threat weapon. Both horse and rider were covered in scale or mail armor, creating an ironclad fist capable of devastating shock charges. But unlike the purely offensive heavy cavalry of earlier eras, these warriors carried composite bows as their primary weapon. Here's where Procopius becomes almost defensive, as if arguing against critics who claimed the old ways were better. The historian emphasizes that contemporary Roman archers far surpassed their ancient predecessors, where ancient bowmen drew the bowstring only to the breast, making their missiles relatively weak. Justinianic archers drew to the ear. This technique, documented across multiple sources, imparted devastating force and velocity to arrows. A fully equipped cataphract could fight as a horse archer at range, peppering enemies with armor-piercing arrows, then close with lance and sword for shock charges. This flexibility was the key Byzantine advantage over more specialized cavalry systems. At Satala, Citas commanded approximately 15,000 men. The breakdown, estimated by modern historians based on typical Byzantine force composition and Procopius's partial numbers, included roughly 3,000 to 4,000 heavy cavalry cataphracts, 2,000 to 3,000 light cavalry horse archers, and 6,000 to 8,000 armored infantry forming the fortress garrison. Local Armenian auxiliaries, motivated by defending their homeland from Persian invasion, reinforced these regular troops. The garrison was well supplied. Satala's ancient aqueduct, a relic of earlier Roman engineering, provided reliable water. Recent success had boosted morale. Just weeks earlier, Citas had launched a daring raid on the Persian assembly point at Theodosiopolis, catching the enemy off guard and plundering their camp. This aggressive commander, connected to imperial power, leading a reformed cavalry army, was about to face a Persian general who was his complete opposite in almost every way. While Citas represented youth, mobility, and innovation, his opponent embodied experience, tradition, and the weight of an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Mihir, known to Greek sources as Murmeros, was one of Shah Kavad I's most trusted commanders. A spa-bed, an army general of the highest rank, he carried the reputation of decades of successful campaigns. But Procopius records a detail that makes this commander unforgettable. The Byzantine historian describes Mihir as, quote, the Persian general was so disabled by age and infirmity that he had to be carried to the battlefield on a litter. Yet in the same breath, Procopius notes that Mihir and was considered this combination of physical weakness and tactical brilliance created a commander who relied on planning and positioning rather than personal heroics. His disability would become relevant in ways neither he nor Citas could have predicted. The army Mihir commanded was a testament to Persian imperial power. Procopius explicitly states that it numbered 30,000 warriors, a massive force representing a major commitment of Sassanid resources. The composition reflected the multi-ethnic nature of the Persian Empire. At its core were approximately 8,000 to 10,000 cavalrymen, the elite noble cavalry that formed the steel fist of Persian military might. The cavalrymen were extraordinary warriors by any standard. Contemporary sources describe their equipment in detail. Each noble cavalryman provided his own expensive gear, maintaining it as a matter of family honor. A fully equipped cavalryman carried a lance for shock charges, a sword, a battle axe, a mace, and 2 composite bows, with quivers holding 30 arrows each, 60 arrows total. Defensive armor was comprehensive. Helmet, hauberk of mail or scale, breastplate, thigh guards, and horse armor that turned both rider and mount into an ironclad juggernaut. But the Persian army at Satala wasn't purely Persian. 3,000 Sabir Huns, explicitly mentioned by Procopius, brought their expertise as horse archers from the steppes north of the Caucasus. These Turkic warriors served as mercenaries and allies, providing mobility and harassing firepower. Approximately 8 to 10,000 Perso-Armenian levies, Armenians from Persian-controlled territories, filled out the ranks. These men fought for Persia, but shared cultural and religious ties with the Byzantines they were invading. 5 to 7,000 Sunnite tribesmen from the Caucasus Mountains added infantry support. Support troops, engineers for siege operations, and the massive supply train required to sustain 30,000 men completed the host. This was a professional, battle-hardened army. The Savaran cavalry had conquered cities and shattered field armies across the known world. But they carried with them a cultural element that would prove to be their fatal vulnerability. Persian armies rallied around their general's battle standard, the Darafsh. The most famous was the legendary Darafsh Kaviani, the imperial banner supposedly originating from the leather apron of the blacksmith Kaveh, who rebelled against tyranny in Persian mythology. These standards were massive affairs. Gold-encrusted banners on long poles, often jeweled and decorated with symbolic importance. The tactical importance of the standard was straightforward. Soldiers oriented on its position to maintain formation. It marked where the general commanded. It provided a visual rally point in the chaos of battle. But the psychological vulnerability was equally profound. Persian warriors believed that if the standard fell, the general had fallen. Loss of the standard triggered an assumption of defeat that could shatter morale instantly. Cultural records preserve this tradition across centuries of Persian military history. At Satala, it would become the difference between victory and catastrophe. As this massive professional army began its march toward Satala, the Byzantines had no idea what was coming. 126 miles separated the Persian assembly point at Theodosiopolis from the fortress. What happened during that march would determine the battle before it even began. Weeks before the armies clashed at Satala, Sitas made a decision that would save his army. He dispatched 2 of his personal guards as spies to infiltrate the Persian camp at Theodosiopolis. This wasn't a casual intelligence-gathering mission. Theodosiopolis, modern Erzurum in Turkey, sat at 1,900 meters elevation in the Armenian highlands. A strategic road junction controlling routes into Byzantine Armenia, it was under Persian control and serving as Mihir Miro's assembly point for his 30,000-man invasion force. The spy mission carried enormous risk. Procopius records that one spy, a man named Dagaris, was captured by the Hunnic allies of the Persians. His fate went unrecorded, but the second spy succeeded in a mission that would change everything. He infiltrated the sprawling Persian camp, observed their preparations, and returned with intelligence that Sitas immediately recognized as actionable. The Persians, despite their numbers, showed a lack of alertness. They were vulnerable to a surprise attack. Here's where Sitas revealed the aggressive tactical philosophy that defined his command style. Rather than waiting for the Persian juggernaut to march toward him, he launched a preemptive strike. Joined by Dorotheus, his subordinate commander, who would play a crucial role at Satala, Sitas led Byzantine forces on a raid against the Persian camp, while Mihir Miro was still organizing his various contingents of Savaran cavalry, Hunnic horse archers, Perso-Armenian levies, and Caucasian tribal warriors. Procopius provides a wonderfully casual description of what followed. The Byzantine raiders arrived at the camp of Murmuros, and plundering everything there, departed at their leisure. The Persians scattered. The careful organization Mir Miro had been building collapsed into chaos. The raiders withdrew safely, carrying intelligence about Persian force composition and leaving behind a shaken enemy that had to spend precious time reconsolidating. The strategic impact rippled outward. The raid delayed the Persian invasion timeline by weeks. It demonstrated that citas preferred offensive action to passive defense. It gave Byzantine commanders detailed knowledge of what they would face. But there may have been a more subtle psychological effect. Modern historians analyzing the campaign suggest that this embarrassment might have made Mihro more cautious, more focused on avoiding another surprise. A commander worried about being caught off guard might neglect proper reconnaissance when he finally did advance. It's a reasonable inference, though we can't know Miro's thoughts. What we do know is that the Persians were not decisively defeated. Within weeks, his 30,000 warriors began the 126-mile march to Satala. This time, the elderly general believed there would be no mistakes. Summer in the Armenian highlands is unforgiving. Procopius explicitly describes the quote, _6 that beat down on the armies in 530 EAD. Modern climate data confirms what the ancient sources record. Temperatures in the Sadak region, where ancient Satala stood, regularly reach 30 to 35 degrees Celsius during summer months. At 1,900 meters elevation, the sun's intensity is magnified by altitude even as the thin air provides little comfort. This was the driest season. September sees barely 26 millimeters of precipitation. The ground turns to dust. These environmental conditions would become tactical weapons. But first, they set the stage for suffering. Armored cavalry, whether Byzantine cataphracts or Persian savaran, faced extreme risk of heat exhaustion. Horses labored in the thin mountain air. The landscape offered little shelter. 60% of the terrain consists of open steppe and meadows that turn yellow under the summer sun, surrounded by rocky mountain ranges. For the Persians marching 126 miles through this harsh environment, every step drained strength from men and animals alike. Satala itself occupied a position that was simultaneously strong and vulnerable. Ancient Satala had been built in a low-lying plain. A geographic feature that Procopius notes in his buildings was originally easy to capture. The city was surrounded and overlooked by many hills, providing potential attackers with elevated positions from which to observe the garrison and rain down missile fire. This was a significant defensive weakness. Justinian's solution had been characteristically ambitious and expensive. He ordered a comprehensive reconstruction of Satala's defenses. The new circuit walls were built to what Procopius calls great height, specifically designed to overtop the surrounding hills. The message was clear. These walls, towering even above the hilltops, would strike terror into the hearts of prospective attackers. Archaeological evidence at the modern Sadak site confirms the massive scale of this construction. Sections of walls of exceptional height still stand, validating Procopius's descriptions. The ancient aqueduct, another Roman engineering achievement, ensured the garrison would never lack water during a siege. As the Persian host approached, covering multiple miles with their 30,000-man army and supply train, Citas made his critical deployment decision. The main garrison, approximately 14,000 men under Dorotheus's direct command, would remain inside Satala's walls. They would use the height advantage to observe Persian movements and prepare for the moment when they would sally forth. But Citas himself took personal command of a select force of 1,000 elite cavalry. Contemporary sources record that he concealed these 1,000 horsemen quote, _11, surrounding the plain. This was the high-risk maneuver upon which everything depended. The 1,000 cavalrymen had to remain absolutely silent and hidden while the Persians deployed for siege. Persian scouts, ranging ahead of the main army, somehow failed to detect this substantial force. It was a catastrophic reconnaissance failure, made possible perhaps by Mihr's physical inability to personally ride out and survey the terrain, perhaps by overconfidence born of numerical superiority, perhaps by simple human error. Whatever the cause, the Persians saw only the fortress. They had no idea that behind the hills, 1,000 Roman horsemen waited in absolute silence, watching, preparing, their horses' hooves on ground that would soon transform into a weapon more deadly than any blade. The Persian host arrived at Satala and made camp at a place Procopius identifies as Octava. The exact location of Octava hasn't been definitively identified by modern archaeology, but the historian provides a precise distance: 56 stadia from Satala, approximately 6.5 miles. This was safe distance for a supply base, far enough to avoid immediate Byzantine sally, but close enough to support siege operations. The Persians established a fortified camp with a stockade, a defensive position they believed would secure their rear as they prosecuted the siege. On the following day, Mihr began deploying his forces for what he expected to be a methodical siege operation. Contemporary accounts describe the Persians forming semicircular lines designed to surround the city. This was standard Sassanid siege doctrine. Encircle the target, close all approaches, apply pressure through bombardment or assault or starvation, and force surrender through overwhelming force. For an army of 30,000 besieging a fortress holding perhaps 15,000, the mathematics seemed simple and the outcome inevitable. The Persian forces spread across a wide front, their semicircular formation extending as they attempted to close around Satala's perimeter. Command and control across such an extended line presented challenges. Communications between units, stretched across hundreds of yards, relied on runners and visual signals. Mihr carried on his litter due to his crippled feet, could not personally gallop along the line to observe all sectors and adjust dispositions. He had to rely on subordinate commanders and the professionalism of his troops. Inside Satala's walls, Dorotheus and the 14,000-man garrison watched from towers that, thanks to Justinian's reconstruction, literally overtopped the surrounding hills. They could observe the entire Persian deployment with clarity. They saw the enemy forces extending farther and farther, the semicircular noose tightening. They knew Citas and his 1,000 cavalry remained hidden in the hills. The timing would be everything. Strike too soon, and the Persians could reform. Strike too late, and the siege lines would be too established to break. Behind the hills, Citas watched the same deployment from ground level. He could see the Persian formation stretching, thinning, becoming more vulnerable with every unit that moved into position. The Persians focused on the fortress, assuming all Byzantine forces were inside those towering walls. Classic overconfidence born of numerical superiority. 30,000 warriors besieging 15,000 seemed safe, routine, inevitable. Why would the defenders risk a sally when they could wait behind fortifications? Why would anyone charge when outnumbered 2-1? As the Persian lines extended farther and farther, closing around the city like a tightening noose, Citas gave the signal. 1,000 Roman cavalrymen charged. The thunder of 1,000 hooves shattered the summer silence. Citas personally led his elite cavalry in a downhill charge from their concealment behind the hills. They struck the Persian rear, hitting the extended siege line at its most vulnerable point. The Persians, focused on the fortress ahead of them, heard the attack from behind. Warriors turned in confusion. Some fell in those first moments of contact. Procopius notes that the charge, quote, 12, though he provides no specific numbers for this initial impact. But the physical casualties weren't the weapon that would break 30,000 warriors. The environment itself became the instrument of Persian defeat. Procopius provides extraordinary detail about what happened next. And his account is so specific, so technical, that it bears the ring of eyewitness testimony. As the horsemen advanced, the historian records, a great cloud of dust was naturally raised by the horses' hooves. Think about the physics of what occurred. 1,000 cavalry charging at full gallop across ground that hadn't seen rain in weeks. The dry summer soil, baked hard by temperatures exceeding 30 degrees, pulverized under the impact of thousands of iron-shod hooves. At 1,900 meters elevation, the summer heat was intense. The dust didn't just rise, it exploded upward in massive plumes that hung in the still air, obscuring visibility across hundreds of yards. The tactical effect was devastating. Procopius explicitly states that this brought great fear to the enemy. The Persians, their view blocked by choking dust clouds, were uncertain as to the number of the attacking force. They couldn't count the attackers. They couldn't see how deep the formation extended. All they knew was that a massive cavalry force was hitting them from behind, from the hills, from a direction where no Byzantine army should exist. Contemporary sources record what the Persians believed in those crucial moments. They supposed that the whole Roman army was coming upon them. 1,000 cavalry appeared, through the lens of dust and panic and surprise, to be 15,000. A 30-to-1 advantage suddenly seemed reversed. The memory of the recent raid at Theodosiopolis, when they'd been caught unprepared and scattered, surged back. The psychological impact rippled through the rear units. Panic is contagious in battle. The Persians abandoned their carefully prepared siege lines. Units tried to mass into defensive formations facing the hills. But they were spread across a semicircular front extending for hundreds of yards. Communication broke down. Orders were lost in the chaos. The neat deployment dissolved into confusion as warriors attempted to reorient from siege to field battle, from offense to defense, from predators to prey. Mihro, on his litter somewhere in that confused mass, tried to restore order. But his physical limitations meant he couldn't ride among his troops, couldn't personally rally units, couldn't impose his will through presence. The spirit of a young man remained trapped in a body that couldn't walk. The dust cloud that made 1,000 appear as 15,000 had another effect. It concealed the Byzantine force's actual size from Persian commanders trying desperately to assess the threat and respond appropriately. The dust cloud alone couldn't win the battle. The Persians still had 30,000 warriors. They were elite troops, battle-hardened Savaran cavalry who'd crushed armies across the east. As they struggled to reorient, something worse happened. The gates of Satala burst open. Timing in warfare separates victory from disaster by seconds. Dorotheus, watching from Satala's walls, recognized the precise moment when Persian confusion reached its maximum. As Cytis's 1,000 cavalry drove into the enemy rear, as the dust cloud sowed chaos, as the siege lines collapsed into defensive disorder, Dorotheus led approximately 14,000 men out through Satala's gates. Procopius records that, quote, 19, a simple statement describing a complex military maneuver that required precise coordination. There were no radios linking Cytis in the hills to Dorotheus in the fortress. No instant communication technology. The coordination had to rely on visual signals, perhaps prearranged timing, perhaps Dorotheus's tactical judgment watching the battle develop. However they achieved it, the result was textbook pincer tactics. The Persians now faced attack from two directions simultaneously. Cytis's 1,000 cavalry hammered them from the rear and the hills. Dorotheus's 14,000 infantry and cavalry struck their front. The Persians were caught between the fortress walls behind them and the hills ahead, trapped in the plain, their extended semicircular formation preventing rapid concentration of force. The dust cloud added visual confusion. Communication across units became nearly impossible in the chaos of melee combat. Both armies engaged in what Procopius describes as a cavalry battle. This wasn't the kind of orderly combat later medieval sources sometimes portray. Hand-to-hand fighting between mounted warriors was brutal, chaotic, exhausting. Lances shattered on impact. Swords rang against armor and shields. Horses, trained for war, bit and kicked, adding their own violence to the melee. Men who fell were trampled. The wounded tried to crawl away from the churning mass of horseflesh and iron. The battle quote 21 according to Procopius. Despite the tactical surprise, despite the pincer formation, despite the psychological impact of the dust cloud, the Persians didn't break immediately. Here's where their numerical advantage still mattered. 30,000 warriors, even caught off guard, even attacked from two directions, still outnumbered the Byzantine force 2-1. The Savaran cavalry were superb troops. They rallied around their standards, particularly the command standard marking where Mihir directed the battle. The visible rally point gave them coherence even in chaos. Procopius explicitly notes that, quote, 22. This was a genuine stalemate. Both forces were taking casualties. The historian doesn't provide numbers, and we have no way to estimate them with confidence. The melee continued, hour after hour under the scorching sun. Exhaustion became a factor. Horses that had already marched 126 miles, that were fighting in heat and thin air, began to falter. Men in full armor, swinging swords and maces, felt their strength draining. The battle hung by a thread. Despite Cytis's brilliant ambush, despite Dorotheus's perfectly timed sally, despite environmental conditions favoring Byzantine deception, the Persians' sheer numbers were holding. Their professional military culture, their Savaran nobility's honor code that demanded they never flee, their visibility of the command standard proving their general still lived and commanded. All of this kept 30,000 men fighting against 15,000, when logic and fear should have broken them. Hours passed. Blood soaked the dust. Neither side would break. Cytis needed something more. He got a Thracian named Florentius. In the chaos of clashing cavalry, one Thracian officer saw what others missed. His name was Florentius. We know almost nothing about him beyond this moment. Procopius preserves his name and ethnicity, but not his rank title, not his age, not his background. He was a commander of a cavalry detachment, one of dozens of officers in the swirling melee. His name survives in history for one reason. He won the battle. During the sustained stalemate, while thousands of warriors hacked at each other and neither side gained advantage, Florentius identified the critical vulnerability. The Persian forces rallied around Mihir's command standard. That massive banner, raised high on its pole, marked where the general commanded. It was the visual center of Persian resistance. Remove it, and remove their cohesion. What Florentius did next suggests either extraordinary courage or a calculated decision that his own death was an acceptable price for victory. He led his cavalry detachment in a deliberate charge toward the Persian center, toward the heart of the enemy formation, where the command group held position. This wasn't a wild act. It was targeted aggression based on cultural knowledge. Florentius understood what the standard meant to Persian morale. Procopius records that he charged into the enemy. The historian uses a verb suggesting violent, forceful penetration. Florentius drove them back, forcing Persian cavalry to give ground through sheer momentum and ferocity. He penetrated through multiple layers of defenders. Every yard took him deeper into enemy territory, farther from support, closer to the elite warriors guarding their general. The Persians fighting in front of Mihiro's position were the best of the best. The household troops, the guards who would die to protect their commander. Florentius reached the standard. Procopius states this as simple fact. He _25_. This achievement alone, penetrating to the command center of a 30,000-man army, would have been remarkable. But reaching the standard wasn't enough. Florentius forced it to the ground. He physically struck down the Persian banner, knocking the massive pole horizontal, sending the jeweled silk crashing into the dust. In the next instant, he died. While he was immediately killed, Procopius writes with almost clinical detachment, hacked to pieces by the Persians who were fighting in front of the general. The guards who'd failed to stop him from reaching the standard didn't fail to kill him. They overwhelmed Florentius, cutting him down, literally hacking his body apart in their fury. But the damage was done. The standard lay in the dust. Florentius had purchased something priceless with his life. Contemporary sources record what happened across the Persian army in the seconds after the standard fell. 30,000 warriors, spread across the battlefield, looked for their rally point. They couldn't see it. The massive banner that had guided them, that proved their general lived and commanded, had vanished. Persian culture, preserved in epic poetry and military tradition spanning centuries, treated the battle standard's fall as catastrophic. It wasn't just a piece of cloth on a stick. It was the embodiment of leadership, the proof of divine favor, the center around which armies coalesced. When the standard fell, warriors assumed the general had fallen. They didn't wait for confirmation. They didn't verify whether Mihiro actually lived or died. The assumption alone was enough. Florentius fell. The standard fell. And in the next instant, 30,000 Persian warriors began to run. The standard hit the ground. 30,000 warriors saw it fall, or saw others react to its fall, or heard the screams of those who'd seen it. What Procopius records next reveals the psychological mechanism that broke one of the world's most professional armies. Quote 29. Think about that phrasing. They thought. They didn't know. They didn't verify. They assumed. An assumption became reality in their minds. Miro was still alive. Still on his litter somewhere in the chaos, still trying to command. But the Persian warriors couldn't see him from across the battlefield. They couldn't see the standard. Simple mathematics. No standard equals dead general equals lost battle equals time to save your own life. Fear spreads faster than courage. The panic began in the units closest to where the standard fell. Warriors who'd been fighting with disciplined ferocity suddenly pulled back. They disengaged from combat. They turned their horses. And when mounted warriors turn away from battle, when cavalry begins to retreat, the psychological effect on nearby units is devastating. If the tough veterans are running, what do the less experienced know that I don't? Procopius records that the Persians quote 30 quote. That's a polite way of describing what was actually a rout. This wasn't an organized tactical retreat with rearguard actions and controlled movement. Byzantine sources describing the scene make clear this was panicked flight. Individual units broke without orders. Cohesion shattered across the extended formation. Officers tried to rally their men and found their commands ignored or couldn't be heard over the chaos. The Byzantines recognized the critical moment and exploited it ruthlessly. The Romans, bringing pressure to bear upon them, turned them to flight. Procopius writes, This is where fresh troops mattered. While the Persians had been marching and fighting in heat and altitude for hours, the Byzantine garrison had been resting inside Satala's walls until Dorotheus led them out. They had energy reserves for pursuit. They pressed hard on the fleeing Persians, striking down those who tried to make a stand, maintaining momentum, preventing reorganization. The warriors who'd outnumbered the Byzantines 2-1, who'd marched 126 miles through mountains to besiege this fortress, who represented the cream of Persian military power, fled across the plain toward their fortified camp at Octava. The camp was 6.5 miles away. 6.5 miles of running, of panic, of abandoning wounded comrades, of throwing away weapons and equipment to run faster. But the Byzantines showed tactical wisdom at the moment of victory. They pursued the fleeing Persians, but didn't pursue them all the way to Octava. Procopius explicitly states that the Romans did not follow them up when they fell back to their stockade. Citas and Dorotheus recognized the danger of overconfidence. The Persians, even routed, still numbered in the tens of thousands. Their fortified camp would be difficult to assault. Byzantine forces, exhausted from battle, would be vulnerable to a sudden counterattack if the Persians rallied behind their defenses. The Byzantine commanders were satisfied with what they'd achieved. The battlefield was theirs. The Persian invasion was broken. Satala was saved. Armenian highlands remained Byzantine. Both sides disengaged. The Persians huddled behind their camp stockade. The Byzantines held the field. Night fell over a landscape transformed. Where 30,000 warriors had confidently deployed that morning, the dust now settled on abandoned equipment, on wounded men crying for help, on the dead staring sightless at the stars. In his command tent at Octava, Mihir confronted the magnitude of what had happened. His army, his massive, professional, imperial army, had been routed by a force half its size, and he was still alive to face that humiliation. The next morning would reveal what came next. Dawn broke over a battlefield where the cost of Florentius's sacrifice became visible in full. Procopius doesn't provide casualty figures, a frustrating gap in the historical record that we have to acknowledge honestly. The historian describes fierce fighting, sustained melee, Persian rout, but he gives us no numbers for dead and wounded on either side. Modern historians have attempted estimates based on comparative ancient battles and typical casualty patterns. But these remain educated guesses rather than documented facts. What we do know with certainty is what Mihir decided. Quote, 33 Procopius records. Quote, 34. The Persian general, still alive and still in command despite his army's belief otherwise, led an organized withdrawal from Byzantine Armenia. He made no second attempt to besiege Satala. He launched no renewed assault. The entire 30,000-man invasion, the massive commitment of Persian resources and prestige, was abandoned. Think about the calculation he faced. The Persians still outnumbered the Byzantine defenders. In pure arithmetic, they retained a 2-1 advantage. But numbers on parchment don't fight battles. Morale fights battles. And Persian morale had shattered with that standard's fall. The warriors had run. They'd fled the field believing their commander dead. Even now, knowing Mihir lived, the psychological wound remained. How could an army that had broken so completely, that had run from an enemy they outnumbered, be trusted to fight again so soon? The Persians had learned something crucial about their Byzantine opponents. Citas and Dorotheus had demonstrated that the reformed Roman army was formidable, that numerical superiority didn't guarantee victory, that the defenders of Satala were more dangerous than anticipated. The risk of a second defeat was too great. Better to preserve the army, to retreat in good order, to live to fight another day than to gamble everything on restoring shattered morale. The Byzantines watched the Persians depart and made their own strategic decision. They did not pursue. They didn't harass the retreating column. They didn't try to turn retreat into annihilation. This restraint reveals sophisticated strategic thinking. Sittas and Dorotheus had achieved their objective. The invasion was repelled. Satala and Byzantine Armenia were secure. Pursuing the Persians into their own territory would require following them through 126 miles of mountains, far from Byzantine supply bases, potentially into ambush positions. The goal was never to destroy the Persian army. The goal was to defend Byzantine territory. Mission accomplished. Preserve the victorious army for potential future threats rather than risk it in overextension. This defensive doctrine, this economy of force principle, would become a hallmark of Byzantine strategic thinking. Modern scholars studying Byzantine grand strategy, particularly Edward Luttwak's comprehensive analysis, cite this kind of restraint as evidence of sophisticated military culture. The battlefield itself bore witness to what had occurred, even if specific numbers remain lost to history. The exact death toll, the precise casualty figures that modern audiences want, simply aren't recorded in our sources. Procopius, who provides such wonderful detail about tactics and movement, falls silent on this question. We can describe the fighting as fierce. We can document that Florentius died and that others fell in the initial ambush and the sustained melee. But honest history requires admitting what we don't know. The sources don't tell us how many died at Satala. What they do tell us is that the battle's impact extended far beyond the immediate casualties, whatever their number. The battle was over. The war was not. But what happened in the weeks after Satala would reshape the balance of power across the entire eastern frontier. Victory on the battlefield triggered victories without bloodshed. Within weeks of Satala, 3 Armenian brothers serving the Persian Empire made a calculation that would change their lives and strengthen Byzantine military power for decades. Their names were Narses, Arrhetius, and Isaac. All 3 were Armenians, ethnic Armenians from territories under Persian control who served in the Sassanid military system. Here's what makes their defection particularly striking. These weren't minor officers or reluctant conscripts. Procopius records that Arrhetius and Narses had previously defeated Roman forces in 527, just 3 years before Satala. They were proven commanders who tasted victory over the very empire they were about to join. They understood Byzantine military capabilities from personal experience of defeating them. Yet now they were switching sides, and they brought their mother with them. That detail, preserved by Procopius, humanizes a strategic decision. This wasn't just individual officers changing employers. This was a family choosing allegiance. Why defect after serving Persia successfully? The victory at Satala demonstrated that Byzantine military power was resurgent under Justinian. The defeat showed Persian vulnerability. For Armenian nobility watching the struggle between 2 empires, the question was always which side offered better protection, better opportunities, better alignment with their interests. Culturally and religiously, Armenians were Christian, sharing faith with Byzantium rather than Persia's Zoroastrianism. That religious alignment created natural sympathies. But sympathy alone doesn't drive strategic decisions. Power does. Satala proved that the Byzantines could defeat numerically superior Persian forces. The tactical brilliance shown by Sitta, the effectiveness of the reformed cavalry, the successful defense of Armenian territory. All of this suggested that Justinian's empire was the stronger horse to back. Persian prestige had suffered. The empire that couldn't protect its own invasion force couldn't guarantee protection for its Armenian subjects. The youngest brother, Isaac, facilitated the defection through direct action. He commanded or had access to the fortress of Bolam, a Persian-held stronghold whose exact location remains uncertain to modern scholars. Procopius describes how Isaac orchestrated a nighttime operation where he secretly opened a small gate to allow Roman soldiers to enter. The fortress was seized without a siege, without significant casualties, through this inside action. Isaac delivered a strategic position to the Byzantines and secured his family's welcome. The reception in Constantinople validated their decision. The three brothers were welcomed by a fellow Armenian, a court official who was also named Narses. This eunuch Narses was a different person from the defecting brother Narses. The name was common among Armenians. But this eunuch Narses would become one of the most important figures in Byzantine military history. He would eventually rise to become supreme commander of Byzantine forces in Italy, the general who would finally complete the conquest of the Ostrogothic kingdom, having fellow Armenians already integrated into the Byzantine power structure, made the brothers' transition easier. Historical sources trace the later careers of these defecting commanders. They were integrated into Byzantine military service and fought with distinction in Justinian's Gothic wars in Italy during the 530s and 540s. They brought valuable knowledge of Persian tactics and Armenian terrain. They provided experienced leadership for Byzantine armies. For Persia, their defection represented loss of commanders who knew both sides intimately, who understood Byzantine and Persian military systems equally well. The cascade effect of Satala extended beyond these three brothers. When high-ranking commanders publicly switched allegiance, it sent a message to other wavering nobles. If even former victors over the Romans were choosing Byzantium, perhaps the strategic calculation had changed. The Battle of Satala hadn't just repelled an invasion. It had triggered a shift in perception across the Armenian frontier about which empire represented the future. These defections stripped Persia of valuable commanders, while strengthening Byzantine armies with men who'd fought on both sides. The balance of power was shifting. Satala and Dara gave the Byzantines battlefield victories. But the war continued. In 531, fighting resumed with the Battle of Callinicum, where the tables turned. Belisarius, the hero of Dara, commanded Byzantine forces, but this time suffered defeat. The loss demonstrated what military historians had long recognized. Neither Byzantium nor Persia could achieve decisive victory over the other. Both empires were too strong, too well organized, too resilient. Every victory by one side was eventually balanced by a reversal. The cycle seemed endless. Then, in September of 531, the strategic picture shifted. Shah Kavad I, who'd launched the two-front offensive that led to Dara and Satala, died. The man who'd ruled Persia through its wars with Byzantium, who'd attempted to consolidate the Caucasus through forced conversion, who'd gambled on crushing Byzantine military power before it grew stronger, passed from the scene. His death created a succession crisis that would determine whether war or peace followed. Kavad's son Khosrau I succeeded to the throne and immediately faced the challenges all new rulers confront. Consolidating power requires managing internal rivals, securing the loyalty of the nobility, ensuring the army remains faithful. Khosrau I, known to history as one of Persia's greatest shahs, recognized that prosecuting an expensive war on the western frontier while establishing his authority at home was dangerous. He needed peace, at least temporarily. The Byzantines were equally exhausted. Years of warfare had drained resources Justinian wanted to deploy elsewhere. The victories at Dara and Satala had given Constantinople negotiating leverage. They'd proven their military could compete with Persia's best. But Callinicum had shown they couldn't achieve total victory. Both empires recognized the stalemate. Negotiations began. In 532, they signed what contemporaries called the Eternal Peace. The name itself reveals the hope and perhaps the self-deception built into the treaty. The terms reflected mutual exhaustion more than clear victory. All territories would return to pre-war boundaries, status quo ante. Nobody gained land. Nobody lost land. Everything returned to where it had been before the fighting started. But the Byzantines paid a price for peace. 11,000 pounds of gold, an enormous sum representing years of tax revenue, flowed from Constantinople to the Persian treasury. This was tribute disguised as subsidy, payment for peace, the cost of securing the eastern frontier. Justinian was buying something precious: time. The diplomatic language emphasized that this peace would last indefinitely, hence eternal. Both sides committed to ending hostilities permanently. Here's the irony that history would reveal. The eternal peace lasted 8 years. Just 8 years before Khosrau I, emboldened by internal stability and envious of Byzantine campaigns in the west, would break the treaty and invade Syria. But 8 years was enough. 8 years was exactly what Justinian needed. With the eastern frontier secure, with Persian armies bound by treaty rather than engaged in active warfare, Justinian could safely redeploy forces westward. The armies that might have been needed to defend against Persian invasion were now available for offensive operations. The resources that would have funded defensive campaigns could fund reconquest. The imperial attention that would have focused on survival could instead focus on expansion. The victories at Dara and Satala, combined with the peace they enabled, had purchased something priceless: the opportunity to pursue the grand strategy that defined Justinian's reign, 8 years. That's all Justinian needed. With the eastern frontier secure, he turned his full attention westward, toward the territories that had been Roman before the barbarian conquests, toward the dream of restoration that obsessed him. The Battle of Satala's true significance wasn't what it saved. It was what it enabled. Within 3 years of Satala, Byzantine armies landed on the coast of North Africa. The target was the Vandal Kingdom, a Germanic tribe that had conquered Rome's former North African provinces and established their own realm with its capital at Carthage. For a century, the Vandals had controlled territories that once fed Rome with grain, that once represented Roman wealth and power. Justinian sent Belisarius, the victor of Dara, to reconquer what had been lost. The Vandal War of 533 to 534 demonstrated what a secure eastern frontier had purchased: the armies, the naval transport, the resources required to mount a major amphibious invasion across the Mediterranean. None of this would have been possible if Persian armies were rampaging through Byzantine Armenia. Belisarius needed to focus entirely on the Vandals without looking over his shoulder toward the east. The eternal peace, purchased in part by the victories at Satala and Dara, gave him that focus. The campaign succeeded with shocking speed. In decisive battles at Ad Decimum and Tricomarum, Belisarius shattered Vandal military power. Carthage fell. The Vandal kingdom collapsed. By 534, North Africa was restored to Roman control. The first major reconquest was complete. But Justinian's ambitions extended further. In 535, he launched the invasion of Italy, targeting the Ostrogothic kingdom that controlled the peninsula. This was the heart of the old Western Roman Empire. Rome itself, the Eternal City, had been under barbarian control for decades. The Gothic War would prove far more difficult than the Vandal War, lasting nearly 20 years and devastating the Italian countryside. But it would eventually succeed. Here's where the connection to Satala becomes direct and personal. The Armenian commanders who defected after witnessing Byzantine victory, Narses, Arrhenius, and Isaac, served with distinction in the Italian campaigns. Procopius's later volumes of his wars chronicle their actions in Italy. Armenian troops formed elite units in the Byzantine army fighting Goths. The tactical knowledge these Perso-Armenian defectors brought, the combat experience they provided, the cultural understanding of how to integrate diverse ethnic groups into effective military formations, all of this enriched Byzantine military capability. The eunuch Narses, the fellow Perso-Armenian who'd welcomed the defecting brothers in Constantinople, eventually rose to become supreme commander in Italy. In the 550s, after years of grinding warfare, Narses would achieve final victory over the Goths and secure Italy for Byzantium. The Armenian connection, strengthened by defections triggered in part by Satala's demonstration of Byzantine resurgence, thus played a role in the reconquest of Italy itself. By the 550s, Justinian had achieved something remarkable. North Africa was reconquered. Italy was reconquered. Even parts of southern Spain fell to Byzantine arms. The Mediterranean was becoming a Roman lake again, at least temporarily. The territorial extent of the empire approached what it had been before the 5th century collapse. This was the grand strategy realized, the dream of restoration made manifest in recovered provinces. None of it would have been possible without the secure eastern frontier. Modern historians analyzing Justinian's reign recognize the interconnected nature of his strategic calculations. Luttwak's study of Byzantine grand strategy emphasizes how the empire operated with limited resources across multiple fronts. Every army committed to one theater was an army unavailable for another. Every gold solidus spent defending Armenia was gold that couldn't fund operations in Africa. Satala had been one link in the chain, enabling this transformation. The battle preserved Byzantine Armenia. The preservation enabled the eternal peace. The peace freed resources for Western campaigns. The Western campaigns restored imperial glory, at least for a generation. Military historians trace this direct connection from a summer day in the Armenian highlands to Byzantine banners flying over Carthage and Rome. Satala had saved a fortress. In doing so, it had enabled the reconquest of an empire. The eternal peace lasted 8 years. In 540, Khosrow I broke it spectacularly. The Persian Shah, now secure in his power and envious of Byzantine success in the West, suddenly invaded Syria without warning. Justinian, caught with his best armies deployed in Italy, could only watch as Khosrow's forces rampaged through Byzantine territory. The Shah sacked major cities, including Antioch, one of Christendom's great urban centers. The destruction and the humiliation demonstrated that Persian power had fully recovered from the defeats of 530. The invasion of 540 began a new cycle of Byzantine-Persian warfare that would last until 562. Another round of battles, sieges, raids, and counter-raids. Another expenditure of resources and lives. The Armenian frontier, including the region around Satala, was again contested. The victories Sittas had won in 530 hadn't created permanent strategic advantage. They'd bought time, a decade of relative peace. But they hadn't solved the fundamental problem of two great empires sharing a border neither could definitively control. Procopius, Agathias, and later Byzantine sources chronicle this renewed warfare with a depressing familiarity. The patterns repeated. Neither side could decisively defeat the other. Both had strong defensive positions, resilient military systems, and the wealth to sustain long conflicts. Every offensive eventually stalled. Every victory was balanced by reversal elsewhere. The stalemate that had characterized Byzantine-Persian relations for centuries continued. Another peace treaty was signed in 562. Like the eternal peace before it, this treaty was temporary. The cycle would continue through the 570s, 590s, 600s, and into the 620s and 630s. Each peace bought a few years of respite. Each war drained both empires further. The mutual exhaustion accumulated over generations. Here's where history reveals its tragic patterns. The Byzantine-Persian rivalry, which had dominated Near Eastern geopolitics for centuries, was exhausting both participants. The constant warfare drained treasuries, depopulated provinces, disrupted trade, and consumed the attention of emperors and shahs. Both empires were slowly bleeding themselves white in an endless conflict neither could win. In the 630s and 640s, weakened by generations of mutual destruction, both empires faced a new threat. Arab armies, united under the banner of Islam, exploded out of the Arabian Peninsula. They struck both Byzantium and Persia at their moment of maximum vulnerability. The Persians, exhausted from their final war with Byzantium in the 620s, collapsed completely. By 651, the Sassanid Empire ceased to exist, conquered entirely by Arab forces. The Byzantines lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually North Africa. All the territories Justinian had worked so hard to defend or reconquer, the empire survived, but in a drastically reduced form. The mutual exhaustion of the Byzantine-Persian wars had left both empires unable to resist the Arab onslaught. Historians analyzing this period recognize that the endless cycle of warfare between the two empires had created the very conditions for their mutual destruction. Satala had preserved the Byzantine Empire for another century. The battle had enabled Justinian's reconquests. The victory had demonstrated tactical brilliance and secured a critical frontier. All of this is historically true, but it's equally true that Satala couldn't prevent the ultimate transformation of the entire region. The victory bought time, not permanence. It created opportunity, not guarantees. So did Satala matter? The answer depends on your timescale. What makes Satala worth remembering 15 centuries later? Military historians studying the battle identify several elements that give it enduring significance beyond the immediate strategic consequences. First, Satala provides one of the clearest examples in ancient warfare, where psychological deception is explicitly documented. Procopius doesn't just tell us the Byzantines won. He explains how they won, and his explanation centers on the dust cloud. This environmental weapon, this use of natural conditions to multiply perceived force, is described with technical specificity rarely found in ancient sources. We can read Procopius's account and understand the mechanism. 1,000 cavalry created dust that made them appear as 15,000. The Persians, unable to count through the obscuring clouds, assumed the worst. Fear did the rest. Modern military professionals studying asymmetric warfare, force multiplication, and psychological operations find Satala endlessly instructive. The principle remains relevant wherever smaller forces face larger ones. Creating the perception of strength through environmental manipulation. Understanding how limited visibility affects enemy decision-making, exploiting the psychology of fear and assumption. These aren't just historical curiosities. They're timeless tactical principles that special operations forces study today. Second, Satala exemplifies the Byzantine principle of economy of force. Edward Luttwak's comprehensive study of Byzantine grand strategy cites the battle as a model for how the empire achieved maximum results with minimum resources. Rather than matching Persian numbers, Citas used terrain, intelligence, timing, and deception. The hills around Satala, originally a defensive weakness, became the concealment for his ambush. The summer heat and dry conditions became weapons. The Persian cultural attachment to their battle standard became a vulnerability to exploit. This approach, using intelligence to identify advantages, terrain to multiply force, and cultural knowledge to target psychological vulnerabilities, became characteristic of Byzantine military doctrine. The empire couldn't afford to match its enemies in pure numerical strength. It had to be smarter, more flexible, more willing to use unorthodox tactics. Satala provided a blueprint. Third, the battle validated Justinian's expensive military reforms. The transition from infantry-heavy legions to cavalry-dominant armies, the development of the dual-role cataphract who could fight as horse archer and shock cavalry, the massive investment in fortress reconstruction, all of this was controversial and expensive. Satala proved it worked. The reformed Byzantine cavalry under Citas defeated the legendary Savaran. The rebuilt walls of Satala provided the secure base for offensive operations. Procopius's argument, woven throughout his histories, that contemporary Roman armies were equal or superior to the ancient legions, was vindicated on the field. Fourth, Florentius's deliberate targeting of the Persian standard demonstrates the importance of cultural knowledge in warfare. He understood what the standard meant to Persian morale. He made the calculated decision that his death was an acceptable price for striking it down. One man's informed courage broke 30,000 warriors' will to fight. Modern psychological operations studies examine this kind of culturally informed targeting as essential to effective warfare. Understanding your enemy's symbols, their psychological vulnerabilities, their cultural frameworks. This knowledge can be as valuable as superior weapons. Finally, Satala poses the eternal question of historical contingency. What if the Persians had won? Reasonable counterfactual analysis suggests that a Persian victory would have prevented Justinian from deploying forces westward. No Western campaigns means no reconquest of North Africa. Italy remains Ostrogothic. Spain remains Visigothic. The Mediterranean doesn't become a Roman lake again. Medieval European development follows a different trajectory. One battle, one summer day, enabled a cascade of consequences that reshaped the 6th century world. These aren't just historical curiosities. The principles Citas employed, deception, terrain exploitation, psychological targeting, cultural knowledge, remain relevant wherever asymmetric conflict occurs. The battle appears in military academy curricula not as ancient history, but as a case study in timeless tactical principles. 15 centuries later, the lessons endure. Today, the battlefield where Citas defeated Mihir lies in rural northeastern Turkey. Ancient Satala is now Sadak village in Gümüşhane province, near the town of Kelkit. The coordinates place it at approximately 40.16 degrees north, 39.96 degrees east. The elevation remains what it was in 530 AD, roughly 1,900 meters above sea level in the Armenian highlands. Geography doesn't change on human timescales. Remnants of the massive Roman walls still stand, partially buried, partially visible. Archaeological surveys have identified foundation traces of legionary buildings, sections of the ancient aqueduct that provided water to the garrison, and defensive tower remains. The walls that Procopius described, built to exceptional height to overtop the surrounding hills, can still be seen in fragmentary sections. Modern archaeology has validated the ancient historians' descriptions. The fortifications were indeed enormous. Much of ancient Satala remains buried beneath the modern village. This complicates systematic excavation. Houses, roads, and agricultural buildings sit atop Roman foundations. Excavation would require displacing current residents or working around modern structures. The site has some protection as an archaeological location, but it's not a major tourist destination. Funding for comprehensive excavation remains limited. Most of the ancient city lies unexplored beneath the soil. The hills surrounding the plain haven't changed. Stand in Sadak today, and you can see the same topography Citas surveyed in 530. The hills where he concealed 1,000 cavalry still rise above the plain. The open ground where 30,000 Persians deployed for siege still spreads before the village. The Persian camp at Oktava hasn't been definitively located by modern archaeology. 6.5 miles from Satala could be in several directions, but the rough distance remains measurable. Visiting Satala requires commitment. The site is approximately 100 kilometers from Erzurum, the nearest major city. That's ancient Theodosiopolis, where the Persians assembled before their march to Satala. The journey takes roughly 2 hours by car through mountainous terrain. Public transportation is limited. Most visitors need private vehicles. There's no museum at the site, no visitor center, no guided tours regularly available. Signage is minimal. This is for serious history enthusiasts willing to travel to remote locations. What you can see justifies the effort if you care about history. The wall remnants provide tangible connection to Roman military engineering. The topography allows you to visualize the tactical situation. In summer, when the temperatures still reach 30 to 35 degrees Celsius, you can feel the heat that created the dust clouds. The air at 1,900 meters is thin, just as it was when armored cavalry struggled for breath during hours of melee combat. The plain where the armies clashed is now peaceful farmland. Wheat grows where warriors fell. The only sounds are wind and livestock and the occasional vehicle on rural roads. The contrast between ancient violence and modern tranquility is profound. Where Mihir Mihro deployed 30,000 warriors, farmers plant crops. Where Florentius charged into the Persian center, villagers tend sheep. Where dust clouds confused and terrified one of history's great armies, children play in summer heat. For those willing to make the journey, Sadak offers something valuable: the chance to stand where history pivoted. You can climb the hills where Citas hid his cavalry. You can look across the plain and imagine the Persian siege lines forming. You can feel the summer sun that Procopius described and understand how dust could become a weapon. The story endures in landscape and ruins and imagination. The dust has long since settled. The standard has crumbled. But the story endures. 1,000 cavalry charging 30,000. A dust cloud becoming an army. A single standard's fall triggering mass panic. A crippled general defeated by aggressive risk-taking. These aren't legends. They're documented facts from one summer day in 530 AD, preserved by the Byzantine historian Procopius, confirmed by the logic of terrain and the patterns of human psychology. The Battle of Satala achieved something immediate and measurable. It repelled the Persian invasion of Byzantine Armenia. It saved the fortress that controlled the upper Euphrates and the Armenian highlands. It triggered the defection of valuable Armenian commanders who strengthened Byzantine armies for decades. It provided diplomatic leverage that helped secure the Eternal Peace Treaty of 532. in purely military terms. It demonstrated that Justinian's expensive cavalry reforms and fortification programs worked. 15,000 Byzantines defeated 30,000 Persians through superior tactics, terrain exploitation, and cultural knowledge. The medium-term consequences rippled outward. Those 8 years of peace, purchased by the eternal peace, enabled in part by Satala's demonstration of Byzantine military capability, gave Justinian the secure eastern frontier he desperately needed. With Persia bound by treaty, he could safely deploy armies westward. Between 533 and the 550s, Byzantine forces reconquered North Africa from the Vandals, Italy from the Ostrogoths, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths. The Mediterranean became a Roman lake again. The dream of imperial restoration, impossible without a secure east, became temporary reality. Satala hadn't just saved a fortress. It had enabled the reconquest of an empire, but honest history requires acknowledging limits. Satala didn't end the Byzantine-Persian rivalry. Wars resumed in 540 when Khosrau I broke the eternal peace. Fighting continued through the 560s, 590s, 600s, and into the 620s and 630s. Neither empire could decisively defeat the other. Both exhausted themselves in endless conflict. When Arab armies exploded out of Arabia in the 630s and 640s, they struck two empires weakened by generations of mutual destruction. Persia collapsed completely by 651. Byzantium survived, but lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and eventually North Africa. The territories Justinian had fought to defend or reconquer slipped away. Satala had bought a century of survival and enabled a generation of expansion. But it couldn't prevent the ultimate transformation of the entire region. The dual legacy persists. Military professionals still study Satala's tactical lessons. The dust cloud as environmental weapon, the pincer coordination requiring split forces and precise timing, the cultural knowledge that identified the Persian standard as the critical vulnerability. Florentius's informed courage targeting that vulnerability. The economy of force principle that achieved victory with inferior numbers through superior positioning and deception. These principles appear in modern special operations doctrine, in studies of asymmetric warfare, in analysis of psychological operations. The specifics change. The principles endure. The human legacy resonates differently. Procopius preserved Florentius's name across 15 centuries because of one heroic act: the Thracian officer's deliberate sacrifice, his penetration to the enemy command center, his striking down of the standard knowing he would die in the next instant. This became the archetype of informed courage. Citus's aggressive leadership, his personal assumption of the highest risk by leading the ambush himself, vindicated his rapid rise and imperial connections. Even Mihir Mihro, defeated and humiliated, retained command afterward. His reputation survived the disaster. All three men demonstrated that courage, calculation, and character matter in warfare. Return to the mysteries raised at the beginning. How did outnumbered forces win? Through documented tactics, concealed ambush, environmental deception, pincer coordination, and psychological targeting. What mistake did Mihir Mihro make? Reconnaissance failure, underestimating his opponent, perhaps physical limitation, preventing personal terrain survey. Why did it matter? It enabled a decade of Byzantine expansion and demonstrated that reformed Roman armies could compete with Persia's best. Sometimes courage matters. Sometimes calculation matters. Sometimes dust clouds matter. And sometimes, and all three combine to change history's course. 15 centuries later, the lessons of Satala persist. Military academies study the battle as a case in asymmetric warfare. Historians debate its place in the Byzantine-Persian rivalry. Archaeologists work to uncover more of the ancient city beneath Sadak village. Travelers willing to journey to remote northeastern Turkey can stand where empires clashed and imagine the dust rising, the cavalry charging, the standard falling. The story endures because it teaches something timeless about leadership, tactics, and the relationship between courage and calculation. Procopius's detailed account allows modern readers to understand not just what happened, but how and why. The historian's descriptions of cavalry equipment, dust cloud formation, psychological mechanisms of panic, and cultural significance of battle standards provide insights rarely available from ancient sources. We can reconstruct the battle with unusual confidence. We can extract tactical principles with unusual clarity. We can honor the participants with unusual specificity, because Florentius's name survived, because Citus's career is documented, because even Miro's disability is recorded. The Battle of Satala stands as proof that sometimes, just sometimes, impossible odds yield to tactical brilliance, environmental mastery, and one Thracian's willingness to die for victory. Where dust became a weapon. Where one man's death purchased 30,000 lives of panic. Where 1,000 defeated 30,000. Where history pivoted on a fallen standard.